Find a copy of the Gospel of Luke in front of you. We turn to chapter 2, verse 39, to the end of the chapter as the study for this evening. When they had finished doing all that was required by the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their hometown of Nazareth. The child grew and became strong. He was full of wisdom, and God's blessings were with him. Every year the parents of Jesus went to Jerusalem for the feast of Passover. When Jesus was 12 years old, they went to the feast as usual. When the days of the feast were over, they started back home, but the boy Jesus stayed in Jerusalem. His parents did not know this. They thought that he was with the group, so they traveled a whole day and then started looking for him among the relatives and friends. They didn't find him, so they went back to Jerusalem looking for him. On the third day they found him in the temple, sitting with the Jewish teachers, listening to them and asking questions. All who heard him were amazed at his intelligent answers. His parents were amazed when they saw him, and his mother said to him, "Son, why have you done this to us? Your father and I have been terribly worried, trying to find you." He answered them, "Why did you have to look for me? Didn't you know that I had to be in my Father's house?" But they did not understand what he said to them. So Jesus went back with them to Nazareth, where he was obedient to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart, and Jesus grew, both in body and in wisdom, gaining favor with God and men. Boys will be boys, but they needn't be. There was one that wasn't. And we're going to look at this amazing boyhood. Out of 30 blank years in the life of the most important person who's ever lived, the veil is only drawn back once at the age of 12, and a tiny glimpse is given us of the way that Jesus developed. It's an astonishing revelation. Our curiosity is aroused by what happened up to that moment and what happened for the next 18 years until the next glimpse we have of the Son of God. We'd love to know, and there have been plenty of people who've been willing to satisfy that curiosity with myth and legend. And when you read the apocryphal Gospels and the incredible things they say about Jesus as a boy, you just know they're not true. For example, there's one story that went the rounds that Jesus, as a boy, took some clay and he made some birds of the clay and he blessed the clay and they flew away. And there's another story about a boy who pushed Jesus into a puddle in a Nazareth street, and Jesus cursed the boy with leprosy to teach him a lesson. You and I know that these are myths and legends. And one of the things that convinced Dr. J.B. Phillips, who translated the New Testament, one of the things that convinced him the Word of God was true was what he called in the title of his latest book, The Ring of Truth. And when you read this story of Jesus as a boy and set it alongside those other myths and legends that are bound to grow up around a person as great and as famous as Jesus, this has the ring of truth and the others are just fairy tales. You thank God you've got a true Bible in your hands. It's not got myths and legends in it. It's got sober fact. And this family doctor, the Gentile Luke, speaking to Mary the mother in her later years, got some of these stories from her. And of all the stories that Mary must have told this family doctor about her son, this is the one he chose to put in his gospel. And therefore, this is the only one that God wanted us to have. And at the end of tonight's study, I'm going to ask, why did God just give us this one? Why is this one so important? And all the rest of 30 years, blank, locked in the memories of Joseph and Mary. It's a very human story. It's very real, true to human emotions. A boy so absorbed in what he's doing that he's forgotten his parents. Parents scolding the boy when they discover. Strong, silent father standing in the background, not saying a word, while the mother really lets him have an earful. There's something terribly real about all this. It's a family, an ordinary family. And yet it's something extraordinary. This little home in Nazareth that Jesus was brought up in, we spoke this morning of what kind of home God would choose for his son, what kind of parents, what kind of income, what kind of culture. I'll tell you this, God, if he were choosing to send his son to England today, would go for a blacksmith's cottage in a Yorkshire dale. I'm quite sure he wouldn't be born in the sophisticated southeast. I think it would be in some little village somewhere that nobody would ever regard as important, and in a humble home where people had to work with their hands and work jolly hard just to make ends meet. And that was the perfect environment for this boy. It was the environment in which he developed and in which he grew. I want you to look first at his growth. It was so balanced. Every side of this boy's life developed, and all the sides developed together. It's the dream of every parent. Very few parents see this dream fulfilled. Most of our sons and daughters, for that matter, seem to go ahead in one direction and lag behind in another. It's always tragic when there's physical retardation or mental. Or sometimes you meet a person whose intellect has developed enormously, but emotionally they've not developed, and so they're still a child in their feelings. And this is a real handicap in their later relationships. And sometimes you meet brilliant people who've developed intellectually, but socially they're no good at all, and they haven't developed in favor with men, and they just can't say anything when you put them in company, and they just haven't adjusted to relationships. But the greatest tragedy of all is where somebody develops physically, mentally, emotionally, intellectually, socially, and remains a spiritual 3-year-old. I've met many like this. Men who can write a check out for £500,000 and think nothing of it. Men who can grasp the affairs of big business, who can play the stock exchange. Men of great talent, great gifts. And they can't pray as well as a kindergarten kid. And they're spiritual pygmies. But Jesus, in this environment of a simple, poor home in Nazareth, developed in every way. What a joy he must have been to his parents' hearts. For most children, I say it again, don't develop in some way. And we have to watch that side of their development. And so here was Jesus, and he grew in stature, in wisdom. Notice, not in cleverness, in wisdom. That's far more important than being clever. You notice that he didn't develop financially? How often parents say, oh, my son has done well, you know. He's earning $4,000 a year now, and he's got 5 men under him. Jesus didn't develop in that way. He didn't develop in social status. He didn't move up from a carpenter's shop to a nice suburb outside. He didn't develop in social status. He didn't develop in finance. He didn't develop in a whole lot of things that we count important. He was not famous, not for the first 30 years of his life. He didn't develop in any of these ways, but he developed physically, mentally, socially, and spiritually. And those 4 kept in balance. And all because of the home he'd chosen. And the blessing of God was with him. In other words, he grew up. Can I put it this way? Jesus, at every stage of his development, was always childlike, but never childish. Even when he was a grown-up, he was childlike. He retained his boyhood name for God into his adult life. Forever afterwards in his prayers, he called God Abba, Dad. And it was the childhood Abba equivalent to our Dada or Daddy. And he kept that in his adult prayers, and he taught us to say the same. Oh, there was a man in hospital here in Guildford not long ago. It was such a joy to meet him. 1 or 2 of you also had the privilege. Came to visit friends from his Devon home, and he came to Hazelmere, had a heart attack, was taken into the hospital here and died a few weeks later. But I saw him regularly during that time, and what a privilege. Just to go into his room, his first sentence would always include the word Father, and he would say some mornings to me, had a lovely chat with Father this morning. Another morning, Father's been so good to me. Father. And it was so Christ-like. And so Jesus remained childlike, but was never childish. What a contrast to those who develop in other ways, but remain childish even when they're adults. As easily upset as a little child. And you want to say to them, grow up. But Jesus grew up. And he discovered the secret of remaining childlike without ever being childish. And that's real growth. Now, the second thing I want you to look at is his initiation. His initiation. All societies have their coming-of-age ceremonies. 21, key of the door. That's an anachronism now in England. 18, 16, where will it stop? We shall be asking our children for the key of the door before long. But every society has its sort of recognized age, and the recognized age for becoming adult among the Jews was, as I've told you, 12. That's why the veil is drawn aside at this age. The age when a boy became an adult. The age when a boy became morally and criminally responsible for his own actions. The age at which a boy took full legal partnership in his father's business and was thenceforward to be found in his father's house. This was the age of 12. And it was at this age that his parents went, as they always went every year, to Jerusalem for the Passover. They needn't have gone. The priest said, only if you live within 20 miles is the law incumbent on you to attend the Passover. And Joseph and Mary lived 80 miles away, and they had to make it on foot too. So that the priests excused them, but Joseph and Mary didn't listen to the priests, they listened to God, and God said, you keep my Passover, so they went. Every year they trudged 80 miles. They couldn't afford to ride, and they'd lose business while they were gone, but they went, God first. And this year Jesus went with them, 12-year-old boy. I've told you before, I'll never forget the sight I had in the chief rabbinate in Jerusalem, that's the main synagogue there, of seeing a boy of 12 with his skull cap on, proudly reading the law, and his doting father looking at the boy, so proud of him. And he was coming of age, growing up. And the Passover was that remembrance of the greatest event in their history, that God is the kind of God who sets people free. That's what it's all about. They use the word redeem. We've got to drop that word now. Since pawnbrokers ceased to be in this affluent society, it's even lost the only meaning it had for us, except, I suppose, those who go to the stock exchange and redeem their shares. But it means to set free, set something free. And the God they celebrated was the God who set them free and got them out of Egypt and brought them to Israel. And every single year, 2 years ago, I was in North Finchley sitting with elders at a table. Some of you were there too, and we had that Passover. And they broke the bread and passed it round, and they poured the wine out and passed it round, and the elder next to me must have seen my face, because he turned to me and said very definitely, the Messiah has not come. But when you break bread and pass the wine around on an occasion like that, you can't but think of Jesus. For our Lord's Supper is just the Passover, but we believe in a freedom that's greater than anything the Jews got from Egypt. When we have communion here, we have it here every Sunday. Why? It's to remember that God sets us free. And we can sense something of this in the Passover here. So they took him up, and it was his coming of age. And then they set off home, and it's so easy to understand why they lost him. It wasn't neglect, it wasn't carelessness. I've told you how they traveled in those days. The wives set off first with the luggage and the tents, and then they walked 15 miles, and then they set the tents up and got the evening meal ready, and then the men came along later in the day chatting, and just in time for the evening meal. Totally unfair, wasn't it? I've exaggerated a little. But the women went first, and they made a slower trip, and the men came along later. And so what happened was this: when a boy was under 12, he traveled with the women. When he was over 12, he traveled with the men. But on this occasion, Joseph would think he'd stayed with his mother. Mary would think he was now with Joseph. And when they met up at the end of the first day out, probably at Jericho, 15 miles down through the wilderness, where's Jesus? Well, I thought he was with you. No? Well, is he with some of the relatives? And it took them another day, the next day, to walk back up. And I can imagine Mary and Joseph chatting, and Joseph saying, now look, he's all right. He's 12 years old. And Mary saying, and Mary, I think, would feel guilty. She'd been charged with looking after the Son of God, and she'd lost him. She must have felt guilty before God. It's all right now, Mary. We'll find him. But the big mistake they make, one day out, one day back, and the next day they spent looking everywhere but the right place. And at last they found him in the temple. Let's look now at Jesus' wisdom. What was he doing in the temple? Now, some of the artists who've painted this scene have got the whole thing wrong. They've pictured a scene of a very precocious boy with his hands uplifted, preaching, and a crowd of learned elderly rabbis sitting on the ground gazing at him awestruck. That's far too precocious. The normal method of learning in those days was by asking and answering questions. It's still the best method of teaching children, asking and answering. And he was no more than learning. It's terribly important, this. He showed a highly intelligent grasp of what was being said, but he was not a teacher here, he was the pupil. And he was learning his Father's business. That's what he was doing. He's learning. So let's get rid of these precocious images in which we think of Jesus teaching everybody else at this stage. He did later. But at this stage, he's learning his Father's business in the very place. And he's assumed that his parents brought him here for this. Maybe he remembered the story in the Old Testament of Hannah, who was given a boy when she shouldn't have had one, when she couldn't have had one. And she took that boy at 12 to the temple and left him there to serve God. And it would have been a normal thing for Joseph and Mary to have done this. He was the firstborn boy, as I said this morning. God had a right to him. If they wanted that boy for themselves, they had to buy him with 5 shekels of silver. This they hadn't done, they couldn't afford it. So this boy belonged to God and to the service of the temple. And he just assumed, did Jesus rightly, that they brought him to leave him there, to learn his Father's business. So when they found him and Mary scolded him, it was Jesus who was surprised. He was amazed. And Mary, bless her, oh, your father and I have been so worried. And still Joseph standing back there. I knew he'd be all right. And Mary's so worried, so human. Where had Jesus slept? What had he eaten? Can't you imagine Mary asking him that? Where have you been? Where did you spend last night? Who's been feeding you? But you see, Jesus is already finding out that his meat and drink is to do the Father's will. I don't know where he's been sleeping or where he's been eating. He's been learning his Father's business, and it was he who showed the wisdom. It was they who were dull. And so his answer tells us something more about Jesus, his vocation. It's Jesus who expressed the surprise that they hadn't realized, and with his answer comes a shock to Mary. Mary had said, your father and I have been so worried. And Jesus replied, my Father, this is his business. This is where he lives. Surely you realize that. Have you been looking all over Jerusalem for me? Why didn't you come to where you left me? To where you brought me? And I can see Joseph and Mary going on to say, Jesus, we didn't bring you here to leave you here. We're taking you back to Nazareth. It was Jesus who was surprised. But at this moment, he reveals one thing, that at the age of 12, he knew who his dad was. And it reveals, secondly, that Mary had never told him, neither had Joseph. They had allowed, as they thought, Jesus to be brought up as a normal boy. Maybe the villagers whispered that he was illegitimate, born outside wedlock. Maybe they said this kind of thing. But Joseph and Mary treated him as their son, and they never breathed a word of his origin. And now he says, my Father. They'd never told him, but he knew. He knew. That's the drama of this moment. And it's this thread that runs right through the life of Jesus. For these are his first recorded words. And his last recorded words before he died contain the same lovely word in them. The first recorded words of Jesus, my Father's business. And the last recorded words of Jesus, Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit. And do you know that that last word on Jesus' lips was a good night prayer which Jewish mothers taught their baby boys? It comes from one of the Psalms. Is it Psalm 31? And that was a prayer. The only difference between the Psalm and the last good night prayer of Jesus, of his life, was the addition of the word Father, which isn't in the Psalm. And so there you have it, the childlike Jesus at 33 saying the prayer that he used to say at Mary's knee. Childlike, but never childish. Father, Father, from first to last. And that's why we believe that Jesus was and is the Son of God. He had no human dad. He had a heavenly Abba Father. Now the next thing I want you to notice is so surprising. since he is so wise and his parents so dull, what would you expect next? Would you expect this teenager as he was now or adult as he was in Jewish eyes to say, right, I am now 12, this is where I've got to be, this is where I stay, I'm sorry, but I'm old enough to make my own decisions. Did he say that? It says his parents did not understand, so he went back to Nazareth with them. You young people, there's an example for you from Jesus, and older ones of us too. What an example. He had every right to say, I'm old enough to make my own decisions, but he saw that they didn't understand, so he went back with them. Isn't that incredible? As I've said, boys will be boys, but they needn't be. Teenagers will be teenagers, but they needn't be. And he went back and was subject to them. Jesus, what are you doing? Do you realize you're turning your back on your father's business and you're going to be stuck in a village shop for the next 18 years because your dad's going to die? Your earthly daddy's going to die and you're going to be left with a family of maybe 12 others and you'll have to look after them and you're going to be stuck in that shop for 18 years. What are you doing? God's purpose is going to be thwarted and stopped. But he went back and was subject to them because they didn't understand. He was ready, but they were not. Does that mean that the next 18 years were wasted? That being tied down to those limited circumstances, those were lost years? Nothing of the kind. What happened during those 18 years? I'll tell you, it's in the Bible. I can tell you exactly what happened. He grew. He grew. Oh, I know he was 12. I know he was an adult. I know he developed in so many ways, but he went on growing. Do you know the important thing about 1973 for you and for me is not what we did, but what we became. Whether your life was exciting and you went round the whole world and you did this, that, and the other, or whether you were stuck in one little shop or office, or whether you had to stay at home and look after aged parents, or whatever you had to do, the important thing is not what you did, but what you became. And when you're frustrated with your circumstances and hear about these distant places and Bangladesh and tearing around the world and exciting things that people can do in Christian service and off to Lausanne and whatever, when you hear about that and you feel, I'm just stuck here, just remember that at the end of the day, God will say, not what did you do, but what did you become? And Jesus went on growing. Physically, yes. In wisdom, yes. And in favor with men, yes. He was very popular with Jesus, until he started preaching, that is. That's usually what finishes it, but he was very popular until then. And until he started telling them about their sins and that he'd come to save them, he was very popular, in favor with men. Nobody would have thought he was the Son of God. They just said, Jesus, great guy. Oh yes, a pleasure to go into the shop. But they never dreamed he was the Son of God. The Bible doesn't record a single miracle or a single sermon during all those years. It wouldn't have been possible. The Holy Spirit hadn't yet anointed him. He had to wait until his baptism and the anointing of the Spirit, and then he could say, in Nazareth, the Spirit of the Lord is now on me. I can now preach the gospel to the poor. I can now make the lame walk. I can now set you free. And when they heard that, they loathed him. Isn't this the carpenter? But for the time being, he was popular and he grew in favor with men and, above all, in favor with God. I don't care whether you're rich or poor next year, whether you have a lot of friends or few, whether you get a better job or not. If you're in favor with God, that's it. And so he grew. We're at the end of 1973. Could I just ask you the question I've had to ask my own heart in preparing this sermon? How much did you grow in 1973? Not what did you do? Not what exciting places did you visit? What exciting things you've seen? But how much did you grow? If you grew, then the year's been worthwhile. Doesn't matter if nobody hears about you. It's been worthwhile. And if you didn't grow, it's been a sheer waste of time. Sheer waste of time. Let me draw the threads together and just look at this story. Why did Luke include this one little story of Jesus? I'll finish with this. Just as it is more important what we are than what we do, in the same way, when you study the life of Jesus, it is far more important that you begin with what he was before you study what he did. Because if you study what he did without realizing who he was, then you won't understand what he did. Am I getting a bit Irish here? Let me explain. This story is here at the beginning of the gospel. It's before he began doing great things. It's before he made the blind see and the deaf hear and the lame walk and the dead rise. Before he did any of these wonderful things. This story hasn't a miracle in it. It hasn't a sermon in it. It just has a clear picture of who he was. He was two things, Son of God and Son of Man. And every one of you listening to my voice needs to know one of those two things. If you are not a Christian, then you need to be told that he was the Son of God. You may well believe that he was a great man. You may well have an admiration for his teaching, but all that's of no use to you till you've realized he was the Son of God. And not just a great man, quite unique in a different category. And you need to believe that before you study what he did, because only then will you see the significance of what he did. You'll see the significance of the miracles now. This was the Son of God. Not a man who discovered some new laws, not some Uri Geller. This was Jesus Christ, Son of God. And if you're a Christian, you need to be reminded tonight that Jesus was the Son of Man. For if there's one mistake we Christians make, it's this, that when we believe he's the Son of God, we forget he's the Son of Man too. And we forget the human side. And so we have these anachronisms in our thinking about Jesus, and we think that he was far more developed than he was at a certain age. And if you look on the Christmas cards, it's usually a 6-month-old chubby child in those mangers. Not a little wizened child just born like a skinned rabbit, and they can look like that. And so then we think of him as a 12-year-old boy, a great philosopher teaching all these wise men. And you see, we've forgotten that he had to grow. We've forgotten that he became so human that he wasn't lying in that manger looking up and saying, well, God, isn't it wonderful? He was not conscious in that manger, I believe, that God was his Father. Part of his incarnation was that he started at square one. At what age did he become conscious that he was the Son of God? I do not know. I know that by 12 he'd come to that consciousness. But he grew and he learned obedience by the things he suffered. And he had to go through life as I've gone through life, having to develop, having to grow, having to understand. And the humanity of it is marvelous. That the Son of God, who had all wisdom, should come and be a baby and have to learn wisdom. Now that does not mean that he made mistakes. It does mean that he was ignorant of things and had to learn them. And he admitted ignorance in his life. He admitted ignorance of the date of his second coming. He said, of that day or of that hour knoweth no man. Not even the Son, just the Father knows that one. He had to learn. There's a difference between making mistakes and having to learn. And we must grasp the humanity of Jesus, that he had to learn as well. He is still human. He's still the Son of Man. He was really down to earth. He was part of our clay. He ate and drank. He was tired. He was thirsty. He went to the toilet, as you have to. Are you shocked if I say that? You see, we're so polite we don't mention it, but he talked about it on at least 2 occasions. He was as real as that. And the Son of God was a man. And therefore, we can now pray to him as a high priest who understands, who's not untouched with our infirmities. He knows. He's human. There is one mediator between God and man, the man, Christ Jesus. And we've brought together in this service thoughts about God in heaven, but you've been brought down to earth in Bangladesh into the filth and disease, and this was the world in which he lived. Our God contracted to a span, incomprehensibly make man. Let me tie together now the 2 thoughts I've finished with. You must understand who Jesus is and what he was before you understand what he did. And if you were to measure the progress in your own life, you must measure it not by what you did, but by what you became. You sang it this morning. For he is our childhood pattern. Day by day, like us, he grew. May God grant that it may be said of you at the end of 1974, if you're still here or if the Lord hasn't come, day by day, like him, you grew. Let's pray. Oh God, you've told us in your word to grow up. To grow up. And we thank you that we know exactly what you mean because we look at Jesus. And we see such a childlike grown up in him. Help us to grow. Help us to remember his humanity. That he still is a man. When he comes back, it will be with his human resurrected body. Help us to remember he's your son, and that we are now called in him to be your sons, and that even here in this dirty, filthy world that we have to live in, a world of disease and hunger and need, that here we can grow up like him because that's where he grew up. Keep us in this world, but keep us from it. Give us life until work is done, and work until life is done. For your name's sake. Amen.